CHAPTER XXIII of the Ins and Outs of Paris, or Paris by Day and Night, by Julie de Marguerite. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How Paris is Educated. Education has been the great cry of the last 50 years in almost every country. France has perhaps joined less in the cry than any other, and as far as free schools for the people are concerned, it may be considered to have fewer than any other nation. The attention of French legislators has been more especially directed towards the amelioration and education of the middle class. This class arose from the ruins of the great Revolution of 1793, the great tiers-état, which for centuries had been accumulating strength, vigor, and intelligence, the elements of that power it at last wrested from the weak and degenerate hands of a class on whom it had once looked with respect, and now scoffed at with contempt. The great middle class is, as it were, the brains of France. From it spring her statesmen, her historians, her poets, her artists, her financiers, even her generals, for valor, almost the prerogative of the nobility of France, has been found hereditary in all her children. The nobility have, however, with some exceptions, become enlightened, and preserving all their traditional chivalry and honor, have voluntarily abjured the privileges of their class, and trusted to themselves alone for distinction. The youth of France are educated in public schools called collèges. These schools are not free schools, and admit no day scholars. These colleges are beautiful buildings, entre cour et jardin, that is, having a courtyard in front and a large garden and playground behind. They are enclosed with substantial walls. All the professors are residents, and cannot, any more than the pupils, absent themselves without the permission of the head of the college, called Monsieur le Proviseur. Before the Revolution of 1830, almost all the professors, especially the principal ones, were Jesuit priests. But now there is an especial law forbidding that any ecclesiastic should hold a situation in any of the public colleges. There is, however, a chaplain attached to each college, and mass is said in the chapel. There is a chapel in every college. The weekly fast, appointed by the Church, is observed, and a day in each month appointed for confession. After the first communion, however, which takes place at about 12 years old, the confessional is rarely frequented, and the practices of religion are somewhat neglected, without, however, calling down any animadversion from the authorities. In the public schools of Paris the priesthood have no influence; they are merely tolerated. The expense of a boy's education in one of these colleges is, including all extras, from 1,000 to 1,200 francs a year. They are all under the supervision of the government, and the government has within its gift free admissions, given to orphans of public employees, or to the sons of men in office, known to be men of moderate fortune. It can bestow either une bourse entière, meaning the whole education fee, or une demi-bourse, in which the father and the government share the expense of the education between them. Each college has a uniform, worn by the boys during the whole of their stay, which is generally from 9 to 19. After going through all the public examinations, the young men of course follow the bent of their own inclinations, and adopt the various callings to which their talents may lead them. The École Polytechnique opens its doors to engineers, both civil and military; and the schools for the learned sciences await those so inclined, on the other side of the Seine. It is usual for almost all young men to inscribe their names at the École de Droit, and to go through the 3 years' course of the study of law, till they are qualified to take the title of Bachelier des Lettres. It is not necessary for this that young men whose families reside in Paris should become students of the Quartier Latin. The study of the law, as far as this goes, consists merely in lectures, which it is possible to attend, even after having commenced life either in commerce, diplomacy, or any other career. In these colleges there reigns a perfect equality. No distinctions whatever are admitted, no privileges. The rich and the poor all fare alike, and fare very well as to bed and board. The utmost cleanliness and regularity is observed throughout the whole establishment. Louis Philippe, either in the interest of his sons, or in the interest of his own popularity, placed them for their education at the Collège Henri IV, where they were treated exactly like the other boys, not even carrying off any very great number of prizes. The princes formed friendships at these colleges, which endured in after life, of course, much to the advantage of their friends. Alfred de Musset was the great chum of the Duke of Orleans. He was of a noble family, but poor and proud. He never condescended to ask a favour. Endowed with extravagant habits, his great genius did not suffice to keep him out of embarrassments, for he was as idle as he was talented. He could spend in a few weeks what should have lasted him a year, and then retire from the world and his friends, until some fresh piece of literature brought him once more to light. The Duke of Orleans, surprised at the abrupt absences of his friend, contrived at last to find out their real motive. He instantly set about seeking in what way he could come to his assistance, and accordingly appointed him librarian of the Ministère de l'Intérieur. Musset accepted the appointment; but on inquiring for the library, in order to assume his post, he was told by the astonished janitor that, within the knowledge of the man, there never had been any library at the Ministère de l'Intérieur. Musset indignantly returned his diploma, writing an angry note to the prince, resenting being treated like a beggar and given a sinecure out of charity. The duke's note deserves quoting: "Mon cher ami, there is no library, I know, but there is to be one. I know it is usual to collect the library before getting the librarian; but this is an age of progress, and I am a prince, therefore privileged to do as I please. So I begin with the librarian. Pray accept the office, or le papa (Louis Philippe) will never get the books. Yours, Ferdinand." Musset accepted the office, with its salary of 4,000 francs a year; but le papa was too fond of his own ledger ever to buy any books, so, after all, the poet's office was a sinecure. It was taken from him by the Provisional Government, but the Imperial munificence has restored it to him. There are, of course, special schools for the profession of arms. There is an École Militaire in Paris, and another at St. Cyr. There is an innate taste for things military in the French nature. The colleges came to a violent insurrection when, by order of the Government, bells were substituted to call into the classes, or into the refectory, for the drums which had summoned them before. A most magnificent institution is the École Militaire de St. Cyr. St. Cyr is beautifully situated near Versailles, and the edifice, now destined to the training of the future heroes of France, was originally destined by Madame de Maintenon for her celebrated school for the daughters of the nobility. Madame de Maintenon had flattered herself that, in conjunction with le Père Élysée, she had discovered a most enchanting system of education, fitted to young girls destined for the world and the court, yet calculated to bring them in safety through the perils of both. The morality, but not the discipline of a convent, was observed. The religion inculcated was but a well-bred, complacent religion. Serious studies, useful arts, were cultivated, but dancing and dressing, and the way to make a graceful court courtesy, were not forgotten. For the young virgins of St. Cyr, Racine, at the request of Madame de Maintenon, wrote his sacred dramas of Athalie and Esther. They were acted by the young ladies in the presence of Louis XIV. And the whole court. Now, though at this period of his life Louis XIV., the gallant monarch, was old and cross, his courtiers were many of them young and susceptible, so were the actresses. Thus, much confusion followed these pious theatricals, not foreseen either by the Père Élysée or his conscientious royal protectress. When Racine exclaimed enthusiastically, "How well these young ladies understand and play their parts!" Madame de Maintenon gravely replied, "Too well," and the religious dramas were stopped. It was here the left-handed Queen of France died, in the midst of her children, as she called them. The institution lasted till the Revolution, whose first principle was destruction, when many of its pupils were taken to the scaffold, and many emigrated. Napoleon, finding the grounds, building and situation admirably suited to the purpose, took possession of them, and established here his École Militaire de St. Cyr, which still subsists. Although we have said that the young noblesse of the Faubourg St. Germain had thrown aside their traditional prejudices, and were mostly educated in public schools, there are still many families who have forgotten the 50 or 60 years in which the world has made the progress of centuries, and still educate their sons as their fathers and they themselves were educated. It has been said that the Bourbons, during their exile, had learned nothing and had forgotten nothing. This saying true of the Bourbons is also true of most of the families who have adhered to the elder branch. The sons are still confided to priests, elected, not amongst the enlightened priesthood of the day, but from the austere Jesuits of old, who, however they may develop the intellect and cultivate the mind, keep both under strict control for their own purposes, sending their pupils into the world with the conviction that all who are not with them are against them, and that everything which differs, in the smallest iota, from the letter of the law, as laid down by them, is sinful, and therefore to be opposed and destroyed. Henry V. has been thus educated, thus surrounded by the bigotry and narrow prejudice of the last century. The noble and faithful friends who have in exile formed his scanty court, look upon the Revolution as an accident, the liberty of the people as an illusion, the era of Napoleon as a legend, and are prepared to begin Henri V.'s reign from the same point as that at which the Vieille Monarchie was first assailed by the 3 accidental circumstances above alluded to. So there is very little chance of their ever being shown the fallacy of their theory. Spite of Madame de Maintenon's institution at St. Cyr, the education of women which towards the end of the reign of Louis XIII. And the beginning of Louis XIV. Was carried to a ridiculous and affected pitch, through the succeeding years, has been much neglected. It was almost exclusively confined to convents, where girls were allowed to remain until they married. What they learned here was the practice of religion, consisting in all its fasts and festivals, a little history, a very little geography, no arithmetic, reading, a moderate amount of penmanship, no spelling, and every description of chain stitch, cross stitch, and tambour. Now there are still convents in Paris where young girls are educated, but the education is very different to that we have described. The nuns themselves are elegant, highly educated, and accomplished women, and the pupils they send into the world are well prepared to fulfill all the duties it imposes. Still, convent education is almost entirely confined to the higher classes, but of late years the Faubourg St. Germain, finding the convents overrun by the Chaussée d'Antin, have taken from England the fashion of resident governesses, and educated their daughters at home. Besides these convents, there are numerous schools for young girls, but day schools are not in favor. It is contrary to the customs of France to expose a young girl to parade the same streets at the same hours, and where a young girl as in France must always be taken and fetched, a day school loses much of its advantages. As soon as a girl arrives at the age of 12 or 13, after she has passed through the grand religious crisis of the first communion, she is no longer allowed to go out of the sight of her mother. However young the mother may be, she must give up the world to a certain extent, that is, abstain from balls, parties, and theatres, from all places, in fact, into which her daughter is too young to go. The mother therefore proceeds to personally superintend the education of her daughter, for which often she is not qualified, at least as far as acquirements may go. To obviate this inconvenience, there has of late years been established in various quarters of Paris classes for all the branches of female education, presided by professors who impart their instruction in the form of lectures. To these classes the inevitable mammas of course accompany their daughters, so that often the class of mammas is as numerous as the class of pupils. The elder class, however, content with their ignorance, or their little learning, pay no attention to the lecture, but armed with their needle and embroidery, a Frenchwoman is never idle, gather into cosy groups and discuss more important and amusing topics than any taught by a professor. This erratic education, we must say from several examples, does not produce any very satisfactory results with regard to its principal object, but it keeps the daughters out of mischief, and prevents the mothers from feeling the temporary loss of the world and its adulations. The private boarding schools of the French capital are, as in most other capitals, good and bad. It has been the fashion of late years for England and the United States to send its daughters to the schools in Paris. It has likewise been the fashion to accuse these schools of ministering to frivolity, coquetry, and vanity. But this is a false accusation, for in no place, not even in a convent, is the world and its vanities so excluded as in a boarding school. In the first place, every school has its uniform, consisting of one dress for the ordinary wear, and another for greater occasions, but alike for the whole school, so that the one great excitement and rivalry of dress is entirely suppressed. Then the pupils rarely go out, They have large playgrounds which afford them exercise sufficient, so that it is not possible they should form any acquaintances. All lessons are taken from the various masters in presence of a teacher, in fact the surveillance or female police, which in France watches over all girls till the moment of their marriage, never leaves them. There is a great public school in France for young girls which has acquired great reputation. It was founded, like almost all the great things in Paris, by Napoleon, and by him was first called Maison d'Education de la Légion d'Honneur, and afterwards Maison Impériale de Saint-Denis. It is intended for the daughters of the officers Napoleon decorated with the Order of the Legion of Honor, which he instituted. The orphans were here provided for, and heiresses carefully educated to become future wives of the generals, from whom Napoleon afterwards formed his court and his nobility. This institution was placed first under the superintendence of Madame Campan, a woman of refined manners and unblemished moral character. She had been one of Marie Antoinette's most faithful adherents, as well as one of her personal attendants, and has left us most interesting memoirs of the Queen and the court. She was admirably suited to give a proper tone to the new institution, rising as it did in the midst of a confusion of opinions, ideas, creeds, and manners. Her pupils, those whose fortunes and conduct have become matters of history, all did her honor, both as accomplished women and as women of high principle. Hortense Beauharnais, the daughter of Josephine and the mother of the present emperor, is one of the brightest examples. Gentle-spirited, amiable, possessing great talents, she was distinguished for her unassuming manners and her attachment to her family and her friends. It is said that she did not marry where her heart directed, yet she was an exemplary wife, spite of scandals which have now died away. Left at last alone, when all Europe was against all she had been taught to love and venerate, having buried in the little church of Ruelle her tender and heart-broken mother, she craved nor pity, nor dower, nor title from the conquerors, but retired to the only free asylum left her on the banks of the Lake of Constance, through which rushes the rapid Rhine, marking its course by its blue waves, which never mingle with the pure and placid waters of the lake. So was it with Hortense. In her heart and in her brain were remembrances which nothing could efface, the world, its duties and its cares, even its joys might come, but still aloof, apart, through all, ran this stream of thought gushing from memory's source, nor looking for rest but in the ocean of oblivion and peace. Here the early days of Louis Napoleon were passed. Like most who have achieved greatness, his mind and character were fashioned by the hand of a noble and distinguished woman. She is indelibly engraven in his heart. How touchingly has he acknowledged her influence, recalling it even after she is in the grave, by making the national air of France the one which greets him on all ceremonious occasions, Partant pour la Syrie, a composition of his mother's early days, when young, lovely, and beloved, she lived in the sunshine of favour and prosperity. But we have wandered far from the schoolroom of the Maison de Saint Denis and its beautiful gardens. The Emperor, whenever he felt in a happy mood, delighted to rush unexpectedly into the classrooms of the institution, and upsetting books and slates, proclaim a general holiday. Then, leading the way to the gardens, he would begin to romp and run with his children. At the Maison Saint Denis he inspired neither awe nor fear. These young girls had never seen him but in their midst, the most riotous and childish spirit of them all, and, as much as Napoleon loved etiquette and respect, he delighted in this utter unconsciousness of both. A collation, sent by the Emperor, terminated these visits; so that perhaps nowhere throughout the vast domain he had made for himself was his name so popular, or was he himself so beloved, as in this institution. The Maison Saint Denis was maintained by the Bourbons, though modified almost into a convent by the Duchesse d'Angoulême, who took it especially under her patronage. Now it has gradually recovered its original tone. It is an admirable institution, and, without doubt, the best educated women in France are those educated at Saint Denis. The orphans of members of the Legion of Honor, who, when they have terminated their education, have no relations to claim them, no fortune to support them, have the privilege of remaining as teachers in the establishment, which then becomes their home. There is, of course, no vow taken, and all have full liberty of egress, under proper protection. The lady superintendents wear the ribbon of the Order of the Legion of Honor within the walls of the establishment. Education in France does not, as in England, tend to a superficial acquirement of accomplishments. As a general thing, French girls have little taste for music. The only art in which they excel is that of drawing. This is assiduously cultivated, and, as we have said in a former chapter, frequently carried to a high state of perfection. Almost all the modern female artists who have attained eminence have been French. For instance, Madame Lebrun, whose historical pictures and portraits hold a high place in the galleries of Europe, though her most renowned picture is the portrait of Marie Antoinette, the best likeness of the queen and the woman said to have been so dignified yet so fascinating. Madame de Mirbel, too, rivaled the famous Isabey in miniature painting. Both were miniature painters to the imperial court, and both have left us a complete gallery of the celebrities of their times. The education of French girls terminates at 18 or 19, the age at which on an average they usually marry. In the commercial classes they leave their studies some 2 years sooner, to assume their places at the ledger, or in their father's magasin. In modern France of the last 25 years, the priesthood has had no influence in education. Banished from the colleges, the priests are almost entirely exiled from the homes of the Parisians. Both boys and girls attend, under the guidance of their mothers, to the outward observances of the Roman Catholic Church until the age of 12, when, being considered fitted by the instructions and preparation they have gone through, for the most sacred rite of the Church, la première communion. The great ceremony takes place with much pomp, and then all seems accomplished. The mother feels she has done her duty, and henceforth her children's salvation is in their own hands. Now, the men of France are not skeptics or atheists as in the times preceding the Revolution; but they are not Roman Catholics, though that is the religion they would confess if called upon to declare their belief. They do not follow any of the observances imposed by the Church. The confessional is rarely occupied by any of the young men of modern France. Neither do they scrupulously attend Mass or Vespers, or observe the fast days. They are Christians. But in France the power of the Church, the influence of the Pope, is gone. They have been demolished piece, by civilization, by education, by self-reliance. None are more aware of these facts than the clergy themselves. Voluntarily do confessors abstain from mingling with the world, or interfering with the domestic affairs of their parishioners. They have changed with the times, they have shaped their course as the current of events directed them, and are now tolerant, unobtrusive pastors. Of course there are exceptions, and those very priests, so humble, so guileless, will still use the terrors of religion with the weak and ignorant, or the thunders of the Church with any rich and bigoted penitent, if such they find. Still the temporal power of the Pope is over in France. Never can it rise again. Never. For its power has not fallen by the sword, nor by violence, nor by revolution, but by the great workings of the human mind, whose action is for ever forward, and cannot again retrograde. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Ins and Outs of Paris, or Paris by Day and Night, by Julie de Margueritte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Foreigners in Paris. Paris, besides the Parisians, contains a population of foreigners which form no insignificant feature in the physiognomy of the capital, although almost entirely confined to one quartier of the city. The hotels, as we have seen, of the Rue Rivoli and Place Vendôme, the whole of the hotels of the Quartier des Tuileries, are almost exclusively frequented by foreigners. But it is not of these that we would speak, but of those who have made Paris their home. Of these the majority, of course, are English. That class of restless English who, having acquired a little money, now aspire to what they cannot attain in the strongly defined circles of their native country, consideration, distinction, and fashion. Now 1,000 a year in London implies for a family, if not poverty, at least privation, calculation, and economy, but by crossing the Channel this 1,000 a year becomes 25,000 francs, and there is as great a difference between what can be obtained in Paris for that sum, as there is in the sound of the two sums, pronounced in English or in French. Your English families of this class abound into the by streets and upper stories of the Quartier Rivoli. They cannot divest themselves of the vulgar English idea that consideration is attached to place and circumstance. True, in order to come within their means they are obliged to be on 5e or on 6e, but still they can put Rue de Rivoli, or Rue des Pyramides, or Rue Castiglione on their cards, and that is so much better than being comfortable in any other rue, unknown to English ears. Your English family, some small city merchant, or pensioned government clerk, or retired lawyer, brings his family over to Paris. Mrs. and her 2 beautiful daughters were not going to live in a villa at Clapham or Kilburn, pulling caps for clerks and clergymen, the only men they ever saw, and these only visible on Sundays. Oh, no. When there was Paris, where they might see dukes and counts, and go to court, and who knows, perhaps to the English embassy, and might marry, there is no knowing who. Long ringlets, plump figures, blue eyes, and dazzling complexions are rare in France. So poor dear Mr. , who had been looking forward all the days of his life to a garden, a pony chaise, and long mornings dawdle over the Times and a twaddling shilling, whilst in the evening, with Sims and Scroggins, is scolded and seduced into transferring himself to Paris. Here behold him dumbfounded, helpless, turned into a mere porte-monnaie, forced to cling to one of his daughters, who, in the purest Anglo-Saxon French, drives all the bargains, of which the only clause confided to him is, "Pay, papa." Papa is the most interesting hero of the family, if misfortune inspire interest, for he is decidedly the victim. Of course he cannot speak French, nor will he try, for somehow he has a vague idea that it would be infringing on the liberty of a free-born Englishman, and unconstitutional, to speak a foreign tongue. He cannot bear going up so many stairs to get home, and you cannot get it out of his head that the upper story of a house is an attic. He will not think floors, however polished, half so comfortable as the commonest Kidderminster carpets, and persists in thinking the French an immoral people, because they stare at the outrageous manners and extravagantly fashionable dresses of his daughters. Still he is forced to be content. Mrs. is an admirable manager. They pay 1,000 francs a year for their apartment. They have furnished it in the Parisian style, and if Mr. remonstrates at some piece of useless luxury, Mrs. exclaims, "But think of the saving in the mirrors!" Be it known that every unfurnished apartment in Paris is always décoré de glace. Mirrors are considered as indigenous to the walls. They have 2 servants, a cook, and a femme de chambre. To each of these they give 400 francs a year, with 2 bottles of wine apiece per week, and Mrs. R says they do the work of 5 English servants, and do it pleasantly too, as if they liked it. In fact, the whole affair is so cheap, that Mrs. R really thinks she will be able to save enough money to send Tom to college. At least, this is the grand panacea applied to Mr. R whenever he sighs for Sims, Scroggins, England, and his club. Meantime, whilst the home arrangements have been diligently carried on by mamma, the exterior diplomacy is no less diligently pursued by the young ladies. Society, society, that is their great aim. They have letters of introduction to several leading families in the English circle. On these they rely for the realization of their chimera. They first, however, visit the milliners and the dressmakers, and order something stylish, something Frenchy, as they say, something Anglais, something ridicule, according to the milliner and the dressmaker, but of course, as they are paid and have given up the idea of inspiring taste to the English, they implicitly obey the orders. Beflounced, becrinolined, our 2 young ladies proceed to pay the momentous visits on which so much depends, taking the Tuileries in their way, where if their object was to be stared at, that object is attained, for every eye and eye glass follows them in their meandering course along the Grande Allée. Mrs. A and Lady B , the 2 great leaders of this class of society, the one a widow of an East India merchant, the other the widow of an alderman but a little richer than the R having no children, and who, by dint of having outstayed every one else in Paris, they have been there some 20 years, have risen to be lady patronesses of all newcomers. Now they look upon all letters of introduction brought to them as so many tickets to dinners and suppers, which they are to receive in return for their patronage. No one was ever known to have had even a glass of eau sucrée in their houses. They receive their friends in other people's houses, and return invitations, by invitations to the houses of those they are called on to patronize. So they make the R give a ball, and to Mrs. R, and the girls' intense satisfaction, their rooms are crowded to suffocation. There were lots of young men with mustachios, some with red ribbons in their buttonholes, besides 2 countesses and 1 Russian princess, who really never went out, but who, to oblige Mrs. R has consented to come on condition of a carriage being sent to fetch and take her back, and a neat little supper prepared for her before the rest, in R 's cupboard of a dressing room, his clothes having been thrust into a sideboard, whilst he dressed in the anteroom, his bedroom being converted into a card room. This Russian princess has done much service as the great gun in English, and American society in Paris for many years. She is very rich, so says report, and very miserly at least, so again says that well-informed personage, report. But she is full of whims and manias, and never receives, though she lives in a large hotel in a fashionable street, but the dignified concierge, as he takes your card invariably informs you, Madame la Princesse ne reçoit pas. The princess was so fortunate as not to have been recalled in the recent flight of the Russians from Paris, the Czar somehow overlooked her name on his list of absentees. As for the 2 other noble ladies, papa, if he plays whist with them, will find out what they are, but they will not play whist with him for some time, they can make more by another game. These ladies do receive all the dissipated and hard-up men in Paris, but they find it difficult to get ladies, therefore are they always on the alert for fresh importations from the 2 lands of innocence and English, whose daughters are allowed to wander out without the chaperonage of their mothers. Now, the 2 Miss R will figure as 2 riches Anglaises at Madame la Comtesse's next réunion, an announcement which will bring round them numbers of adorers, all titled and well dressed, putting the girls' brains, if not their hearts, into a flutter of vanity and delight. These adorers will follow the R girls from party to party in the circle of acquaintances, which will have grown out of the grand ball given by the R . Flirtations will ensue, carried on under a mask of mutual deception, and ending in mutual disappointment, for both parties are too wary to marry without mutual explanations. So, from flirtation to flirtation, from party to party, these girls drag through their youth, ending generally by marrying in desperation some young English clerk, over on a holiday for a few weeks, who, knowing no better, is smitten by what he thinks French graces, and so they go back to Islington or Clapham, ill-tempered old women, discontented wives, and totally unfitted for any of the duties of life. Mrs. R meantime finds that the necessaries of life being so cheap, her family and herself have so launched forth in the luxuries, that it is even harder to make both ends meet than it was in England. After all, it is papa who at last is the most contented. He has, in the whirl in which his daughters live, found 2 or 3 old cronies with whom he can rail against the French and talk politics. He reads all the English papers at Galignani's, then spends his time by searching after good sherry, port, brown stout, and English medicines, expending the little French he has acquired, in trying to persuade the French butchers to cut up their meat à l'anglais, as he calls it, for he disdains genders, and to serve him a decent joint. This class of foreigners, by far the most numerous in Paris, are the people who bring Paris society into disrepute and spread at home the noise of its immorality, whilst in reality they have never seen any French people at all, or only such as respectable French people never do see. There is another class of English, besides the diplomatic circle, consisting of younger branches of great families, authors, artists, and people whose large families exceed their means. These are to be found in the streets adjoining the Champs Elysées in the Faubourg St. Honoré. These families have access to the very highest society, both French and English. They do not seek to disguise that they are not rich, and decline most of the invitations tendered to them. The real motive of their residence in Paris is that their children may enjoy advantages of education which could not be attained in England. Besides, for intellectual, social people of refinement, intercourse with the intellectual and refined is a necessity. To descend in the scale of social life is impossible. Solitude would be preferable. To frequent their own circles in England, with moderate means, would be impossible, without subjecting them to mortifications which would wound their self-respect. Therefore do these families come to Paris. Here fortune is but a secondary consideration, in the metropolis of hearts and ideas, Its absence excludes from nothing but ostentation. Artists, literary men, diplomatists, the élite of the Faubourg St. Germain, the ambassadors themselves, are all friends of this class of English, where the amenity of manners, the high-bred tone, the sparkle of wit and intelligence, repose from the glitter and tiresome routine of the world. The theatres, all the museums of art, all the academies of sciences, are visited by these sensible specimens of foreigners in Paris. Once or twice in the course of the year they go to the Embassy, where they are treated with the greatest distinction. The only class they do not see is the class we have described. Your Mrs. R s would give their ears to enter their little salons; but as they cannot, they stare at them at the Ambassador's chapel every Sunday, quiz their bonnets, and vote them old fogies. It may not be uninteresting to give an aperçu of the prices of the various masters, for which the English take their children to Paris. An admirable music master can be had for 5 francs a lesson; a vocal teacher of great ability for the same price, provided a name is not to be paid for, when as much as 25 francs is charged. For instance, Garcia, Bordogni, Lablache are all at the latter price, and Rubini and Rossini, when they could be induced to give singing lessons, charged as much as 60 francs a lesson. Lessons in foreign languages are, on an average, paid 3 francs, drawing at the same rate. As for dancing, that varies, but it is not expensive. It must be remembered that all these lessons are private lessons, and that the professors come for that price to the houses of the pupils. Next in number to the English are the Poles, and now the Hungarians. These 2 nations, with few exceptions, are like the Greeks, better when wedded to immortal verse than when seen in all the prose of everyday life. The Poles, at least those who leave their country, have an irresistible tendency towards the chevalier d'industrie. They are ever in search of some extraordinary coup de fortune, or of some extraordinary person, who shall suddenly give them the means of really being what they strive to appear. An honest industry is beneath their dignity. The Polish and Hungarian refugees are the heroes of the Cockney English balls, whence they hope to extract a rich wife. Some, the rich wife failing, are content to take a poor one, who can give a home and a daily dinner, thereby considerably increasing the managing contrivances of the Mrs. R s, so lucky as to get such a son-in-law. There is, however, a most bright and particular exception to this rule, in the person of a distinguished nobleman, on whom the hopes of his countrymen for some time rested, Prince Adam Czartoryski, who for many years has now been domiciliated in France. He holds a species of Polish court, and lives in almost royal style, in an old palace in the ancient part of Paris called the Hôtel Lambert. Eugène Sue has described this magnificent specimen of architecture and decoration in a novel of his which bears that name. Prince Adam and his family are remnants of a past age, chivalrous, noble, above the world and its strifes, resigned to their exile, awaiting other times with patience and dignity. The princess is known for her charities, which make no distinction of creed or nation, but which, however, are especially dedicated to the relief of her countrymen. Prince Czartoryski has a very large income at his command, and therefore has much within his power. He has, however, shown his judgment by refusing to listen to any offers, however tempting, even though they offered him the crown of Poland. The hour is not yet come. Another distinguished Pole is M. Louis Walewski, who, to begin, confesses, unlike most of his countrymen, that he is not noble by birth. But nature made him noble by endowing him with her best gifts, and giving him strength and courage with them to work his way to fortune. He is one of the professors at the Institution des Arts et Métiers. Italians, too, we have in Paris, refugees, of course, but, to their honour be it spoken, neither idlers nor swindlers. Italians are ready to do anything for a living, from chorus singing to shoe-blacking and shaving; and they will confess the calling to which circumstances have reduced them, without the slightest shame, ending with a shrug and a smile, that makes one smile also, instead of pitying. The Italian aristocracy had for some time its representative, in one of the most accomplished men of his day, the Prince Emilio Bel, handsome, a profound scholar, well versed in all the modern languages, the best shot, the best swordsman known, an accomplished musician, with a voice like Mario's, only with more power and vigour, he with an independence worthy of respect and admiration, when first he escaped from the Austrians into France, went as an assistant professor in Grisier's saloon. But there he was soon discovered by the young nobility of France, who had often been his guests in Milan, and he was not suffered to pursue his self-sacrifice. Shortly after, his fortune was partly restored to him, and for years he was the ornament of French society. Now he has chosen another lot. He has abandoned the world, and on the beautiful lake of Como his life is spent in the cultivation of the arts, with one who has left a position as high as his own, the world, mankind's, her own esteem, for his love. The Princess Belle , his wife, from whom he was separated a year after his marriage, had for some time a salon in Paris, but she was bitten by a political mania, and repaired to Lombardy to make a revolution. Having failed in leading the troops on to victory, she has now taken to Eastern habits, a long pipe, and corresponding with the New York Tribune. Now we come to very delicate ground, on which we will not presume to tread heavily, but merely to skim lightly over. We allude to Americans in Paris. As a class compared to other foreigners, they are not numerous. The Americans generally appear to prefer Italy to Paris. But the few who are in Paris, usually rich specimens of upper tendom, come there resolved to make as much noise as possible. They outshine and out-Herod your English by a good deal. The men invariably get into the very worst society to be obtained for money in Paris. They dress ridiculously, always do things no one else would do, and at hours when no one else would do them, but where there are plenty of lookers on, whether to blame or to approve matters not. Notoriety appears to be their passion here as well as at home. A fast young American, such as those who come to Paris, persists in confounding all French women into two classes, lorettes and grisettes, that is, as far as virtue and morality are concerned. This generally ensures his being turned out of the first respectable house he gets into, and so throws him amongst the very class he has been seeking, with whom he of course affiches himself. The American ladies, however, have more tact and sense, though even they delight in outraging the customs of the country in which they reside. It must be confessed, however, that the Americans are in far better society than the English generally. There is no rule of exclusion, as by English etiquette, and then people are not exacting, we beg your mercy, about Americans. They have no standard whereby to judge them. So, to Europeans they are all alike, and the French people, tired of English snobbery, are inclined to pet the originalité américain, that half-civilized country of which, by the by, they know as much as they do of the mountains in the moon. Americans have admirable opportunities, therefore, of going into the best society, both French and English. But, in general, those who are rich do not choose to be admitted into society, but insist on being themselves leaders of fashion, an attempt which ends in disappointment and exclusion, and brings some who have been leaders here back in disgust, and make others remain and spend their money for the satisfaction of feeding hungry Poles, Italians, Hungarians, black-leg Englishmen, or fourth-rate Frenchmen, and obtaining the title of le restaurateur américain. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Ins and Outs of Paris, or Paris by Day and Night, by Julie de Marguerite. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The influence of women in France. In no country has the great topic of the day, the great question which has agitated philanthropists, the rights of women, been so little discussed or so little spoken of as in France. The women of all classes appear to be perfectly satisfied with their lot, with their position, with the rights that both the laws and society concede to them. From the very earliest times of her history, the influence of women has been felt in France; and the Salic law was perhaps instituted not from any conviction of the inferiority or incapacity of the sex, but as a measure of safety to prevent men from losing even the very semblance of power. In ancient Rome, it has been said, all the great revolutions were caused by women; but in France it must be remarked that women have achieved, not destruction and disorder, but glory and reform, according to the period in which they lived and its necessities. If France has preserved its nationality, if it is still amongst the nations of the earth, it is owing to the influence of women. When the successful arms of England had conquered France, and aided by the tyranny and oppression of the various factions which divided it, had established everywhere its power, 2 women arose from the ranks of her own people. One, beautiful, tender, loving, and devoted, Agnes Sorel, who roused the desponding energies of Charles VII., and sent him from her side to claim his kingdom and his crown. The other, Jeanne d'Arc, a humble peasant girl, whose imaginative mind evoked a vision from her dreams, and led her to fight and conquer by the side of her sovereign, restoring to France its name and existence. As we proceed in the history of France, we find women either ruling openly under the title of regent, or counseling under the title of wives or mistresses. The name of every monarch of France is connected with some female influence, by whose name often the events of a reign are recalled. We are not historians, and will not, therefore, trace the power of women through various ages; but, coming down to more modern times, will stop at the great mind which overshadows and directs the giant movement of the French Revolution. We refer to Madame de Staël, whose intellectual endowments were not surpassed by any of the great spirits which the chaos throes of that period brought so numerously to the surface. At 17 she wrote a remarkable financial work, having shared her father's cares and studies when he had the direction of the finances in France. There can be no doubt but that the crisis of the Revolution, prepared by the writings of Rousseau, Voltaire, and the Encyclopédistes, was materially aided by the pen of Necker's daughter. Unlike the works of women, her political writings were distinguished for their plain common sense, their close reasoning, and their adherence to facts. Madame Roland, another woman who influenced one party of the Revolution, the Girondins, wrote eloquently, admirably; but having had no scope for her imagination and her enthusiasm, in the days of her girlhood, when love usually calls these 2 faculties into life, she expended both on her political writings. Her influence, therefore, was not lasting, and only affected a few within her own immediate circle. Yet did that influence sway the most gifted, the noblest of this party, beginning with her husband himself, who, though he might listen to the opinions of all, never took counsel but from his wife. To come still nearer to our own time, the popular storm which drove Louis Philippe from his throne is to be attributed to the press, which fanned ever by its burning pages the fire of liberty and revolt, ever existing in the bosoms of the French people. In those days, the pamphlets, the articles which ever passed from hand to hand, which were read in public meetings, which were so dreaded by the one party and hailed by the other as the signal which pointed the way forward, were traced all by the hand of a woman. A woman, it is true, who had disguised herself under the name of a man, but a woman still, George Sand. Her pen, too, wrote the proclamations and speeches which, for a short time, drew the attention of Europe on Ledru Rollin. Had she had power of action, as well of counsel and words, she would have spared the cause much ridicule and censure, even though she had not achieved its ultimate purpose. French women have a great natural talent for politics. Almost all politicians meet in the salon of some woman, whose rank and intellect entitle her to discuss the great events of the day, which, after all, will, some few years afterwards, be taught as matters of history to her grandchildren. The Princess Lieven, the widow of a Russian prince, who was for many years ambassador to the court of St. James, but who is a naturalized Parisian, has ruled and still rules most of the cabinets of Europe. So much for the political influence of women in France, an influence of course confined to few, and to the upper classes of society. But in all ranks, women in France have more power than in any other country. And this is mainly attributable to the sphere of usefulness in which the manners and customs of the French have placed her. In the middle classes, the wife has the entire management of the domestic arrangements, not in the sense understood by domestic arrangements in this country, actually doing the work of a domestic, but ordering, superintending, and administering all the home expenses. French women learn arithmetic and the true value of money; it is a portion of their education, so that they can have no self-deceptions as to what a restricted sum will purchase. Order is one great quality of French women. Though they have much of the imaginative faculty, they do not apply it to the most inexorable of things, money, and never gratify an extravagant caprice under the impression that chance, or their husbands, may find the means of paying for it. A French woman possesses the entire confidence of her husband with regard to his income and his means of making it, therefore she can have no illusions. Then extravagance of dress would not increase the esteem of those around her, but rather diminish it. Therefore there are no temptations to overstep the boundaries of prudence. French women go very little out into the streets. The husbands return home to dinner, which takes place between 5 and 6. In every class, dinner is the grand event of her day. The husband knows it too, and the thought of the welcome which awaits him, quickens his step as he leaves the tedious office or counting house where perhaps a wearying occupation, or an ill-tempered superior has exhausted and worn his spirit. As he goes along, he thinks over his vexations, and wonders what ma femme will say about it all, and he feels how she will sympathize with him, how advise him. Eagerly he crosses his threshold. The familiar smile, and the nod of the portress, who has seen him come in at the same hour for the last 10 years, first make him feel that he is somebody. Then he mounts the stairs, and his wife, who has watched his arrival from the window, taking her station at the very hour and minute he turned the corner of the street, is standing at the entrance door ready to receive him. As he enters the ante-room, a savoury smell proceeding from the kitchen tells that there too he was waited for. Madame, as she passes along, calls out, "Servez, Jeannette! Voilà Monsieur! Dinner, Jeannette! Here's your master!" To which said Jeannette replies, popping her good-natured face and her white cap out of her domain, "Tout de suite, Madame, et tout chaud, pour réchauffer Monsieur." "It's all ready, ma'am, nice and warm, I only waited for master." Here, too, he was expected. His spirits begin to rise, spite of adverse circumstances and dissatisfied employers. He feels that there is a place in the world where he is of as great importance as those who have made him feel he was a nobody. And he proceeds through the dining room, glancing at the brightly white tablecloth on the cosy round table, with its clean napkins, its bottle of Bordeaux, and its pile of bread, all tokens of welcome. He enters his wife's room. The salon is for great occasions, and there all is neatness and even elegance, for Madame's room is furnished like a parlour, with the exception of the well-curtained bed in an alcove. The wearied husband heaves a sigh of relief as he looks around him and sinks into his own comfortable armchair. The wife sees that there is something wrong, but she does not begin to tease him by questions, to add to his annoyance. She has a woman's, and what is more, a French woman's tact, so she is not likely to commit any such blunders. At dinner she is more attentive than usual to his wants. He is more silent. She talks to him, tells him the occurrences of the day, whom she has seen, what she has read, the news of the day, all, in fact, to lure him into cheerfulness. She knows that though she may have had annoyances, and perhaps felt a little dull and solitary, he has had cares and toils. She does not expect him to come home prepared to listen to petty grievances, or to amuse her listlessness. She feels for him, not for herself, and prepares to soothe away this temporary cloud. When they have dined, when they have taken the tiny cups of mocha with which dinner concludes, when they are again in the cosy room where Jeannette has let down the curtains and made a bright fire, there is a moment's silence. The husband has recourse to the invariable French habit, which wood fires have created, and which, to express it, has a verb of its own, untranslatable in any other way but by explanation. The verb is tissonner, and the thing consists in taking the tongs, which in France are very ugly and ill made, but small and light, and playing with the pieces of wood which continually detach themselves from the logs, and piling them up again; an amusement which, though incomprehensible, appears to have the soothing effect of smoking on the temper and spirits. After a few moments, the wife, placing her hand on her husband's shoulder, will gently say to him, "Qu'as-tu, mon ami?" Then the floodgates will be opened, and all the grievances of the day told in all their detail. But told in that quiet, happy room, with the loving eyes gazing on him, even as he tells them, they appear less; and before he has finished speaking, he begins almost to wonder how such trifles could have affected him. Then she sympathizes so thoroughly, but never irritates. She dwells on words of an equivocal meaning, and shows them all in the brightest light. Then he smiles, and he thinks he was a fool; and with one or two decided thumps on the logs, puts down his tongs, and leaning back in his chair, begins to talk cheerfully. Sometimes the wife, who is, as we have said, the administrator of the household expenses, will draw from her secrétaire some hidden saving, 10 or 15 francs, and in order to entirely dissipate the dark atmosphere, will laughingly propose to treat her husband to one of his favourite theatres. In an instant her bonnet and cloak are adjusted, the neatest of gloves buttoned, and they are gone, each capable of enjoying to the full the genius both of authors and actors, and each enjoying both more, because they are enjoying them together. Woman's influence thus gently felt, the influence of every hour, is one which never decays, and which ensures the happiness and purity of the home circles. It is an influence never asserted, therefore never disputed, and the husband himself scarcely knows to what extent it exists. There is another source of woman's influence, too, in a class distinct from the one we have just described, that is employment. Mutual employment of both husband and wife to their mutual interest, and in the interest of their children. In the various trades of Paris, there are very few, excepting those exclusively devoted to men, such as tailors, saddlers, and so forth, where the wife and husband are not together, in the shop and counting house from morning till night. They have their home above their shop, and they repair together, leaving the shop in the care of the première demoiselle, to take their meals with their children, enjoying this family meeting as a moment's respite from the daily toils, and talking of their future plans, or the amusements which next Sunday is to bring forth. Now, the husband has no need of a confidential friend, to whom to confide his perplexities or embarrassments. His wife knows all his liabilities, all his resources. She will advise with him, devising the best means to meet them, or, with the ready wit and quickness of a woman, find some resource or expedient which she has never thought of. Then he has no anxiety as to his cash, for his wife is cashier, and makes up the books. All fear of being cheated or robbed is therefore removed from his mind. Their interests are mutual, so he can attend to the outside trade, the buying and selling in the wholesale market, in perfect security that no one is taking advantage of his absence. Madame, however, though she is a woman of business, does not forget that she is a woman, and does her best to be an attractive one, both in her dress and in her manners. In this class a dereliction from virtue is almost unheard of. The change in society, which has taken away the pomp of circumstance from the nobility, and reformed its morals, has taken away the only danger to which this class of women was exposed. The seduction of a marchande by one of her own class has perhaps never occurred, and were it to happen, the justice of society would fall as severely on the man as on the woman. A marchande therefore desires to please universally all that come into her shop. She is amiable, cheerful, agreeable, polite, and graceful to all, making no distinction of sex, though perhaps taking a little more pains to please the women than the men, because it is a more difficult task. Flirtation, intrigue, or passion never enters her well-regulated head. She has no time for them. She has no moments in which she feels that life is a burden, that her husband is not so elegant as Monsieur , that she is an unfortunate woman, misplaced on earth, understood by none. She never sets her grief to desponding rhymes, for she has her double entries to make. She has very little time, too, to give to literature in general; but after the shop is closed, and her children have said their prayers, kneeling at her feet, she just reads a page or two of the feuilleton which her careful husband cuts out of the papers and pins together for her especial use. She is fond of music, too; but then it is only of a certain kind, and we are afraid to say it is not of the best, and certainly not of the most scientific kind. Her idea of music consists in those wonderful little tunes introduced into the French vaudevilles, at the most critical and exciting moments. These, words and all, she catches up with the most extraordinary rapidity, and carolling them about in the most joyous manner, with a tiny little canary bird voice, to the delight of her children and her husband, the former loving the air, and the latter the little epigram at the end of each verse. In her dress she follows the grace of the fashion, but not the material. Her merino dress will be of exquisite fineness, her collar and undersleeves of immaculate whiteness. Charming will be the covering of lace and ribbons she wears on her small head. Beneath its softening shade are displayed the thick glossy bandeaux of her jet black hair. and even if she could possess no claims to beauty, there is such a refinement and a grace about her, that even by the side of her most elegant and fashionable customers, she attracts and charms. Her good temper is unceasing, her vivacity untiring, her health always good. Nerves she has none to torment either herself or her husband. She thinks attaques de nerfs are the privileges of riches and idleness. Generally, in this class, the women are superior to the men, a fact of which they are fully aware, but of which they sedulously refrain from making their husbands aware; though, of course, unconsciously they feel its effects in all around them, and in the happiness they enjoy. The great object of the wives of this class is to keep their husbands from the cafés and billiard saloons, into which the necessary intercourse with men in commercial life would lead them. For this they are ever on the alert to provide some inducement to remain at home. A French woman does not give up the art of pleasing her husband the instant the honeymoon is over. She, on the contrary, begins to try her power after marriage, for before marriage she has been allowed scarcely any opportunity. The influence of such a woman is felt by all. She is the life and spirit of the house; and when we think how large a class of the population of Paris is included in the commercial class, we must acknowledge that woman has a most extended power over a very important part of the population of the capital. In the highest ranks, women are surrounded not only with the usual courtesy and deference due to the sex, but are looked up to with a degree of poetical worship. It is the boast of this new world that a woman can travel from one end of the country to the other without being insulted; but in France, not only is she certain of not being insulted, but she is sure of meeting with every aid and attention she may require; and this though she is aged and has no attractions, as surely as though she were young and beautiful. Women, to this day, in France, are surrounded with the halo of chivalric days. The appearance of a woman always produces some effect. No man ever passes a woman on a staircase without raising his hat to her; and on the footpath, way is deferentially made for her. Dinners and assemblies exclusively of men are very rare things in France, compared with other countries, and to the presence of women may be attributed the almost total absence of intemperance in the better classes of society, where it would be regarded as a crime; whilst, for the same reason, it is rarely seen amongst the people. As a mother, the very customs of France have established an extraordinary power, by decreeing that mother and daughter should be ever together; and the most beautiful examples are daily seen of the tender friendship which binds them together through their lives. Women are, too, protected by the laws. Their property is settled on themselves, enjoyed and administered by themselves, and returns to their own families should they die without children. A woman never abandons her own name, though of course she bears that of her husband; yet in all important or legal documents she signs her maiden name, adding her married one. To young girls is left influence in the home circle. Though debarred from the liberty of choosing their associates, going into public, or on to the streets, there is no restraint put upon girls at home. There they are the pets of the father, of the brothers, cheerful, unaffected, and good tempered, because free from the bickerings of vanity, they are the life and poetry of home. Paris has been called the paradise of women; and though, of course, it is but an earthly paradise, and not exempt from woe and sorrow, still, should any disembodied female spirit be condemned to resume her earthly career, and revisit the glimpses of the moon, we cannot but think she would choose the moon which gleams on the gilded dome of the Invalides, the spires of the Tuileries, and the turrets of Notre Dame. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the Ins and Outs of Paris, or Paris by Day and Night, by Julie de Marguerite. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Parisian Society and Parisian Celebrities. Of all subjects connected with Paris, the subject of this chapter is one upon which foreigners know the least, and about which the grossest errors have been promulgated and believed. In describing, as we have done, the various classes which in Paris have a distinct physiognomy from the same classes in all other capitals, in enumerating the various forms of refinement which even vice and error take in France, it must not be supposed that we have been describing what is called society. Neither the lorette, nor the grisette, nor the students, nor, with rare exceptions, dramatic artists, are admitted into what is called society. Unlike every other country, each of these classes has a distinct circle of its own, in which it perpetually revolves, a circle recruited from its own ranks, and not aspiring to any other. One of the distinctive characteristics of the French is, indeed, a certain dignity, which precludes that degrading craving for richer and higher acquaintances so universal elsewhere. The outward forms of French society are full of etiquette and ceremonial, almost to coldness. French manners are the quietest in Europe. Loud talking, loud laughing, anything that draws the attention of the many on an individual is in the very worst taste, and sedulously avoided by Parisians, both men and women. So that what people call French manners, meaning noisy, boisterous conduct, such as to attract the eyes of a whole circle or a whole theatre on one person, are by the French people quietly set down as either English or American. Under the Bourbons, the return of many of the old noblesse from immigration, or from their country seats whither they had retired during the Napoleon era, brought back the manners of the old court, or Ancien Regime, as it was now called. Whatever fault may have been found with the morals and the political institutions preceding 1793, it would be impossible in any way to criticize the manners of that epoch. Refinement and politeness could go no further. However much France may have been reformed and altered since that period, it must be admitted that the manners, altered as they are, have degenerated. To the reign of Louis Philippe may this alteration be traced, and to the great fusion which has taken place between the French and foreign nations. From the pipes of the Germans came the habit of smoking, modified by the polite Frenchman into the less obnoxious cigar. From the English they borrowed their mania for the turf, calling it le sport, and imagining themselves English because they imported English grooms and horses, and tried to imitate the brusquerie of English manners. The accession of Louis Philippe brought into high places a class which had been long struggling for the outward emblems of the power they already possessed, having in their grasp wealth which ruled the world. This class brought ostentation in its train, vanity, haughtiness, and pretension, an eager desire to outshine every one, an assumed contempt for the advantages of birth and position, and an insatiate desire to be received and recognized by those they pretended to despise. To speak plainly, the reign of Louis Philippe put vulgarity into a court dress. Still, it was French vulgarity, and in a very short time it learnt how to wear the folds of its drapery with grace. Still, the inauguration of the Finance, or la Chaussée d'Antin, changed the simplicity of French society. The Chaussée d'Antin gave great suppers, grand dinners, had quantities of servants, whole hotels instead of apartments, walked upon velvet, ate off gold, so that au sucré, old-fashioned furniture, well-waxed floors, and two servants who had lived all their lives in the family, but were anything but stylish, dared no longer to call itself society. And the very first elements of society, wit, genius, and good breeding, were forced into obscurity, and overshadowed by the more seeming, and by what is valuable only when it enhances intellect. But this golden rule had but a short reign. It expired from very weariness, and was of itself forced, having the shadow to seek the substance. First, artists were coaxed into the circle, though artists are an independent set, disclaiming patronage. Meeting, as they do, encouragement and appreciation from the government, the church, and the highest aristocracy, they are entirely exempt from toadyism. Still they came, led perhaps by curiosity, and retained by flattery and praise, the coin that wins the artist sooner even than the coin of the realm. Then came alliances between the quarterings of the noble faubourg and the money chests of the Chaussée d'Antin, an exchange which softened the rude angles dividing the two classes, gradually making them dissimulate their riches, and the noble subdue his pride. Louis Philippe, too, when he found himself firmly on his throne, began to weed his court. And gradually society recovered its tone, having, by the slight social chaos through which it had passed, destroyed many of the partition walls of prejudice. Society in Paris, now in its present state, has accomplished a fusion, without which society is merely party spirit, tending rather to establish bitterness of feeling than social intercourse. Still, it has established it with certain restrictions, which are more inexorable in Paris than in any other country in the world. Parisian society cares not for riches, though it does not refuse to admire and enjoy an occasional display, but it envies it not, and habitually dislikes it. Parisian society cares not for birth, it cares not for fine dresses, though it requires a strict adherence to cleanliness and forms, but is perfectly indifferent as to price or quality of material. When we say that in no country is a strict adherence to the proprieties of life, and to its moralities so exacted as in France, we shall probably meet with many incredulous readers. Yet such is the fact. It is not French, as common tradition has it, for wives and husbands to go different ways. On the contrary, whatever may be their way of living at home, society exacts that, when coming into its circles, they should come together, whether to theatres, balls, or parties. Society, too, in Paris exercises a control over the conduct of young men. These liaisons that we read of, these extraordinary derelictions from the right path, may be very well for a newspaper paragraph, and the Paris correspondent may make much of them, showing off his own wit, but giving as false an idea of the capital from which he dates, as the French editor of a popular paper did of New York, when he gravely spoke of the sombre Quaker population of that exceedingly fast city. We do not mean to advance that the morals of La Jeune France are purer than those of La Jeune anywhere else, but we advance and maintain that they pay homage to virtue, by keeping their dissipations from the public. Being fond of the society of women, and respecting their mothers and sisters, they sedulously conceal all female associations which might call a blush on their cheek. All illegal alliances, all gallantries are more or less known, but they are never talked of, neither are the adventures of dancers and courtesans ever openly alluded to, nor their names ever mentioned in society. That is, in the presence of men and women fulfilling the duties of their station, and living according to the laws of God and man. Some, disposed to cavil with all that is French, merely because it is French, may call this hypocrisy, and think it adds to immorality. But we might as well cavil with a couple who quarrel only at home, because they did not also quarrel in public, and accuse them of misleading society as to the way in which they agreed. With regard to the conduct of women, society in Paris has established rules which, in some measure, limit the power of scandal, and certainly act as a restraining principle in the absence of a higher, on women in general. As far as regards unmarried women, we have already explained that there is but one rule: that they should be always under the safeguard of their mothers, observing a reserve of manner, which the little influence they exercise in society of course inspires. Now, with a married woman, the rules are quite as well defined. As long as a wife lives under her husband's roof, as long as his presence with her in public sanctions and protects her, the world may whisper — the world is notoriously fond of whispering everywhere — its opinions and observations, but it has no right to openly manifest its disapprobation or its suspicions. But if once a woman forfeits the protection of her husband, if she is separated from him, and his home is no longer hers, then the animadversion of the world has free scope to exercise its malice or its censure. So strict and invariable is this rule, that when a young woman is separated from her husband, without any fault being imputed to her, she gives up society, even though she may have again sought the asylum of the paternal roof. She is no more seen, excepting at rare intervals in numerous assemblies, or at balls, or even too frequently at theatres or public promenades. The only independent position for a woman in France is that of a widow, and without wishing to accuse the gentler sex of any magic way of getting rid of their husbands, it is strange to say that there appear to be more widows and young widows in France than in any other country. The young widow in France enjoys every privilege. She is the only woman who may flirt, dance, come, go and dress exactly as she pleases. She is the great resource of the French dramatists. All the heroines of French comedies and vaudevilles are jeunes veuves, because that is the only condition of woman which allows of the very necessary ingredient in a French comedy of ostensible love making, ending of course in a usual fifth act catastrophe, a second marriage. The great feature of Parisian society is its simplicity and sociability. Invitations are of course given for any great festivities, such as dinners, balls, and concerts, but there is scarcely a house in Paris, beginning from the upper classes down to the lower grades, which has not its own small circle of friends meeting uninvited, excepting by general invitation, every evening throughout the year. At these meetings there is no dress or ceremony, no obligation to stay a long or a short time, the only obligation is to bring a good temper, good manners, intelligence, and as much wit as nature has bestowed on you. If ever social life or sociable parties really existed, it is in these réunions, where each contributes to the entertainment of the whole, where no extraneous resource is admitted, where neither the want of music nor dancing is felt, and yet where the hours pass cheerfully and profitably along. French women are not what is called accomplished, therefore there is no terrible sonata to be thrown off, no excruciating bravura to be endured, and the French as a nation are not a dancing people now, whatever they may have been. There is not 1/4 as much dancing in Paris as there is in London, and not 1/3 as much as there is in the principal cities of the United States. There are balls for about 6 weeks in the year, and occasionally in the summer a bal champêtre, at a village fête, but as a general thing the frequenters of these reunions would as soon think of proposing a horse race as a dance, though in the English society in Paris, no sooner do 6 people get together, than for want of ideas and conversation, the young people take to giggling and polking. Although the young men of France may not be as good classic scholars as the senior wranglers of Oxford and Cambridge, they have far more general information. The French mind, too, has a tendency to analysis and philosophy, and the language has an epigrammatic turn favouring essentially the vivacity of general conversation. As we have before said, men are fond of the society of well-bred, intellectual women. The proof of this may be seen in the deserted cafés, which from the dinner hour to midnight are left to foreigners, provincials, and waiters, and in the impossibility of establishing in Paris clubs, such as are so numerous in London. A club in the French acceptation signifies a political meeting, or, when by the Anglo-Manes taken in its English meaning, these clubs have degenerated into decent gambling houses. Frenchmen cannot understand the enjoyment of doing nothing but lolling about, looking at a parcel of men in all kinds of sans souci attitudes, or dozing over an old newspaper. They prefer general society, society where each holds a place, and it is perhaps because in these assemblies every one has a part to play, and is of some importance, that they are so liked by all, so frequented, and so inherent to the French character. The art of conversation is therefore in France the most esteemed. Wit, information, learning, vivacity, knowledge and sentiment infused into one local current, and clothed in correct and elegant language is considered as the greatest accomplishment that can be possessed. A salon where the most brilliant conversationists are known to assemble will be sure to attract in Paris, in preference even to the most splendid fête. This thorough appreciation of individual qualifications and talents, it will be seen, considerably decreases the power and importance of wealth. This it was that made the gilded saloons of the Chaussée d'Antin so dull, and obliged them to seek to penetrate the charm which nightly filled many little cramped apartments with all that was distinguished and brilliant. A few years ago there were several saloons of this description, the furniture of which would have been disdained by the fine soubrette of the parvenu, but where nightly met the ancienne noblesse, the noblesse of the empire, all the distinguished statesmen, foreign ministers, authors, editors, and artists, together with women of the highest standing both for position, fashion, and reputation. To be an habitual frequenter of these réunions was like receiving a diploma of distinction and talent, and though all were desirous of penetrating within the magic circle, many kept timidly back, knowing that there the false coin would not pass current, and that the genuine coin, emanating from the brain, would have to pass through an areopagus of critics, and could alone recommend them. Such was the salon of the Duchesse de R . She was an old woman who had emigrated, and on her return had found all her fortune, estates, and houses, sold by the Revolution as biens nationaux, a transaction which the Restoration found they were obliged to sanction, as to alter it would have entailed endless confusion. The Duchesse, therefore, reduced to a pension, was obliged to live in a small apartment, in one of the modern houses of the Quartier des Tuileries, in all about the size of one of her saloons in her former residences. On what floor it was can scarcely be told; how many stairs there were up to it, impossible to ascertain, for one lost one's breath before having done counting them. But when one got up, the very landing was filled with footmen and chasseurs, in all the liveries of the best families of France, holding the cloaks, shawls, and paletots of their masters and mistresses. The tiny ante room, where they should have been, was crowded with men wearing all sorts of stars and orders. The tiny salon would have made the fortune of a daguerreotypist, who could have taken all the portraits at once, for there seated in a small circle, in the centre of the room, were all the women, either of fashion, talent, or beauty, who were objects of curiosity and interest to the whole Parisian public. The Duchesse herself, in her heavy grey satin dress, her point lace ruffles and cape, her silvery hair frizzled and curled round her pale, refined face, having on her head a lace cap with plain white ribbons, sat in an armchair by the fire. The place of honour which the etiquette of Parisian saloons decrees the mistress of the house should never give up to any guest. The motive for this apparently uncivil custom being that the lady of the house should be ever at her post to receive her guests and to do the honours, which consists here in the bringing congenial spirits together, by a judicious question drawing out the peculiar talent of some one individual, or by some new idea reanimating the conversation when it appears to flag. The chairs and sofas drawn out from the wall allowed of the gentlemen circulating freely behind the ladies, and leaning over the backs of the chairs to converse with those they knew; though in the immediate circle of the Duchesse, conversation was general, every one put in his word and no introductions were necessary to join in it. Leaning against the chimney were the men most distinguished for their conversational powers, such as Balzac, Thiers, Genet, M. de Custine, M. de Montalembert, Berryer, Victor Hugo; and many whose names have attained no other celebrity than that they received from their ancestors, but who were mostly men if not brilliant, distinguished for their good breeding, and a dignity of manner which has died out with their ancien régime. In the Duchesse's bedroom adjoining the salon, assembled all the politicians and foreign ministers. A pony who has so long represented Austria in France, as almost to have become a Parisian, Lord Granville, whom in spite of his perfect knowledge of French it was impossible not to recognize as the British representative; M. Lehon, the Belgian minister, whose great distinction was in being the husband of the beautiful Madame Lehon, now seated by the Duchesse in the adjoining room; many of the ministers and members of the Chambre, financiers, the most distinguished members of the bar, magistrates, historians, all the more serious luminaries of the great social system were here to be found. Guizot, Minet, Thierry, a Frenchman who has written English history, Sismondi, the historian of republics, Michelet, who has brought to light the poetry of history. Here was Seguier, the hereditary president of the Supreme Court in Paris, whom Napoleon, when he set things in order after the Revolution, nominated in compliance with his hereditary right. Seguier was then very young, and when, after his nomination, the Emperor saw him, he was startled at his appearance. "Are you not very young for a president?" said he. "How old are you?" "Exactly the age," replied Seguier, "of your Imperial Majesty, when you won the battle of Marengo." Napoleon never doubted Seguier's capacity after this. At the Duchesse de R.'s there were no refreshments of any kind. If any of the guests were thirsty they asked the Duchesse's maid — she had no manservant — for a glass of water. Many of the visitors remained but a short time, proceeding from thence to other parties, for it became the fashion, for all who were fortunate enough to have the entrée, to go to the Duchesse's reception, if only for a few minutes, if it were only to catch up, as they sparkled around, some of the bons mots, opinions, and repartees of the chosen there assembled. The Duchesse never went out herself. These receptions were the only amusement, her only communication with the outer world. She had come back to her native land a lonely woman, a childless widow, but she loved to see youth around her. She loved to hear familiar names echo in her ear. The pleasures of the world had lost their attractions, but the mind, with its ever varying powers, could charm her still. Paris contained numerous salons like this. The salon of Madame Recamier, the friend of Madame de Staël, who, endowed with angelic beauty, had passed through the difficult period of the Consulat aux Empires, without scandal even breathing on her name. Her manners were so modest and reserved, she was so silent, that whilst people admired her beauty, they doubted the powers of her mind. The vicinity, too, of Madame de Staël, whose constant companion she was, may have thrown her into the shade, for Madame de Staël's brilliancy was overpowering. In the decline of life, Madame Recamier withdrew to the Abbaye aux Bois, a convent in which there are apartments for ladies who seek quiet and retirement. There are few convents which still retain this custom, so prevalent in the 2 preceding centuries, and it must also be said that the number of women who grow tired of the world has also considerably lessened. Madame Récamier, however, though still attractive, preferred a dignified retreat from the world, rather than to wait for its abandonment. She attracted around her the very élite of Parisian society. The constant visitor and faithful friend of Madame Récamier was Monsieur de Chateaubriand. His memoirs d'outre-tombe were read here, chapter by chapter, as they were written. The tone of Madame Récamier's salon was graver than the usual réunions of Paris, and had a religious tendency suitable to a convent. The celebrated preachers of the day, Abbé Ravignan, Lacordaire, eloquent as an apostle with the earnestness of a martyr, and an ascetic imprinted on the pale sharp features, and on the broad high forehead, which from thought, watching and fasting, had acquired the yellow tint and the polish of ivory. The Abbé Coeur, the most ungraceful and inelegant of speakers, but the most logical and profound theologian. Then M. de Genoux, the founder of an establishment for the reform of the repentant Magdalens of Paris. Lamartine, too, would bring his poems here. The tender verses of Gosselin were read in this calm and most fitting atmosphere. The ladies of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, the Mortemarts, the Montmorency, the de la Tour, all who preserved their allegiance to church and state, here met as on hallowed ground. Here occasionally bishops, missionaries, and dignitaries of the Catholic Church would mingle in this circle where all was eminently orthodox and high principled, contrary to the established order of the present day, when the clergymen never mingle in society. Madame Récamier's salon ignored all the progressiveness of the age, and would perhaps have been the vivacious salons accused of ennui, but it was very exclusive, and therefore much sought after. Art has always been patronized by the Catholic Church and thought compatible even with its most austere tenets. Therefore, when the fame of any great artist resounded through Paris as to re-echo in the great halls of the Abbaye aux Bois, Madame Récamier would express a desire to hear and see them, and her friends, who frequented the gay as well as the grave world, would hasten to gratify her wishes. Here Giulietta Grisi has sung to the applause of archbishops. Rubini and Lablache have come prouder to sing to this audience than to the one which welcomed them every day. Here the young tragic muse, spite of her Jewish origin and her avowed devotion to the religion of her fathers, was presented in the early days of her fame. Here she recited, giving lessons in eloquence to the most eloquent, the passionate verses of Corneille and the majestic poetry of Racine. None of the wits of the day, or feuilletonists or innovators, found entrance here. Indeed, it is to be doubted whether Madame Récamier and her noble friends knew of the existence of many of those who were stars of the first magnitude in other circles. Madame Émile Girardin, the daughter of an authoress, Madame Gay, the wife of a literary man, celebrated in many ways, and herself an authoress of great talent, also held a salon at once literary, artistic, and political. Madame Girardin is a brilliant conversationist as well as a brilliant writer, both of feuilletons, novels, and dramas. She is besides an amiable woman, and a woman of elegant and refined manners. In this respect, the blue stockingism of Paris outshines all others. A literary réunion in France does not present an assemblage of dishevelled ringlets, faded ribbons, and draggled draperies. Women here, spite of their genius, condescend to dress like other people, with elegance and taste, and though they have genius, strive to look as pretty as they can. Look there, by the crimson curtain which forms so good a background for a picture, there seated in an antique Louis XIII chair, is a lady whose unpretending dress has not yet attracted you. Yet now you have observed her, see how gracefully the folds of black velvet fall around her, what ease and grace in the attitude, the arms folded and the head raised towards a gentleman who is leaning over her chair and earnestly conversing with her. How well the black lace and those scarlet ribbons harmonize with the lustrous black hair and the pale complexion. Are the features handsome? Who can tell? The mouth, with its vigorous and well-defined outline, first attracts, but now you have caught the glance of those deep, lustrous, sad, mysterious eyes, you will see no more. You are fascinated, dazzled. Although those eyes have rested on you but a moment, you see them still. They have suggested thoughts and feelings in that single moment, such as are roused by a strain of solemn music, or some low melancholy murmuring verse. Who is it? Have you examined the almost romantic beauty of the person who is speaking to her? His high forehead, his magnificent hair, his long, soft, waving beard, his chiselled features, and the almost infantine expression of the face. No? And yet he too is wonderful. He too is a genius, the poet of music, the author of the Desert, Félicien David, who caught the divine inspiration in the sandy plains of Egypt, where he saw the red sun rise and set, transfixing in immortal rhythm the sublimity of the infinite. Still you gaze on those eyes. They haunt you still. Now they are bent down, shaded by their long lashes. Often they are so shaded, as though weary of gazing on the world. Ah, they are raised again, and a gentle smile unbends that firm lip. A lady greets her, a lady of gentle aspect and manners, yet with a face in which tenderness and benevolence are blended. That is Madame Raybon, the authoress of many beautiful, tender, imaginative works, whose first book, Val de Pierrat, made her at once a celebrity. But you care not. You are still watching those wondrous eyes, and the grace and dignity of the few gestures which accompany the deep tones of that earnest voice. Ah, genius has then a magnetism, she on whom you look, she whose passing glance you will never forget, is Madame Georges Sand. Will you come with me now into some of the genial, happy, and sparkling salons of Bohème, into the palace of the tragic muse herself, where, in addition to the prettiest and most talented of all the actresses, Brohan, Dauch, the Dame aux Camélias, Desjazette, Rose Chérie, Cruvalie, Caroline Dupré, and 20 more you will find, all the literati, all the actors, Bresson, Ligier, Frédéric Lemaitre, Lablache, etc., etc., and most of the jeunesse dorée of Parisian life. But you will not go. You are not attuned to brilliancy to night. Let us home. As we pass along and see the lights gleaming from every window of every étage, you may be sure that within each is a little circle of old friends, who for years have met at each other's fireside, and who, if not brilliant or celebrated, are cheerful companions and fast friends. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of the Ins and Outs of Paris, or Paris by Day and Night, by Julie de Marguerite. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A little about a few artists. We have been many times on the confines of Bohème, and have always paused at its limits. Nor must it be supposed from the title of this chapter that we are about to penetrate into its recesses and its mysteries. They are not for us. Charming and fascinating, curious and extraordinary as they may be, we will not enter the charmed circle, we are not of the initiated, Bohème would scarce unveil its secrets to us. We are going to speak of artists, it is true, yet they belong not to Bohème, though Bohème receives and recognizes them whenever it can get them within its precincts. That, however, is seldom, if ever, for the artists whom we are going to visit are amongst the aristocracy of talent, they have access to every class. Welcomed in the highest, in the noblest, but independent, and cringing to none, they have formed a circle and society of their own, within their own walls, within their own families, from which they can rarely be lured. Paris, the test of talents of all nations, has become the home of many foreign artists, and Italy, with all its charms, has failed to recall many whom Paris and London had idolized and enriched. Not that we mean to insinuate that any rich or prosperous artist ever settled in London. Do not imagine such a preposterous thing ever happened. There is no artistic society in London, merely patronizing and lionizing. There is no Bohème in London. All that is not virtue is vice, dishevelled, glaring, grovelling vice, without hope, without shame, so that the artistic world, when it has made its guineas, has nothing better to do than to hurry over the Channel to regain its dignity, its pleasures, and its power. So many Italian artists have become Parisians, and their houses neutral ground between society proper and Bohème, are amongst the most interesting salons into which you can get admitted. Of these artistic homes, the most brilliant and most agreeable is that of the great singer Lablache. His wife, who was as handsome as himself, does the honours of his home with grace and dignity, though with perfect simplicity, seeing rather to the material comforts of her guests than aiming at providing for the entertainment. This, however, in the laissez-aller of artistic society, is not heeded, in either master or mistress, for each provides his own entertainment, and chooses his own associates. Lablache, quaint, full of the wit of a Frenchman and the grotesque humour of an Italian, is the life and soul of his circle. In that circle there are numerous children of his own, all of whom have married artists, or are artists themselves, full of animation, full of talent, brought up with profound admiration for the world of art, having no higher ambition than to be one of its distinguished disciples. Lablache's eldest daughter is the wife of Sigismund Thalberg, a gentle, delicate woman, created to be the idol and consolation of poor wearied genius. If ever genius meets success and stems the torrent of opposition, or is not broken against the rocks of the world, it is that it finds its guardian angel, to hold it up through all. Love, too, has a genius of its own, not every heart is endowed with it, yet no holier mission can woman find on earth than to minister to one of earth's chosen spirits, and great is her reward. To be the first to hear the strains which shall entrance the world; to gaze as first the pencil traces them, on images which shall become immortal; to listen to the melodies of poesy, as beneath the poet's inspirations, first they fall into rhythms that future ages shall repeat. Is this not high destiny enough? With cautious, ever watchful care, to turn aside the petty shafts of mediocrity, the wearying cares of sordid life, poor genius never yet could brook. To soothe the melancholy which comes over genius in its happiest hours, when, like the murmur of some distant sea, the memory of a brighter sphere re-echoes in the heart, this is tender woman's happiest lot, and for it the world owes to her its deepest gratitude, for 'tis her fostering care that gives to it the full powers of genius, that sends forth untrammelled by meaner cares, the poet, the philosopher, the painter, all whose names are engraven on the annals of the world. Thalberg's wife has been all this to him, and he has lavished on her all his love and all his wealth. When first they were united, a cruel malady had paralyzed the bride, and she could not leave her sofa, except in her husband's arms. Many were the scoffs and sneers at this strange love, but the artist heeded neither. "Madame Thalberg," said he, "need never walk. Her husband can always provide her with a carriage." Lablache is proverbially kind to young artists and poor artists. They may be found here joining in the merriment and cordiality of the meeting, forgetting for a few hours their own struggles and their poverty, and as they look around them at the luxury earned by their benefactor, an artist like themselves, they are led to hope that at some future day they too may have a luxurious home and happy faces round them. Lablache is renowned for his suppers. He has a great appreciation of the material, as well of the artistic good things of life. All the provision merchants of the Palais Royal know the glorious basso and smile as they see his portly figure coming along the galleries, looking with the eye of a connoisseur on the fish, flesh, fowl and fruit, displayed to tempt the palate and despoil the purse. Another family of Italian artists settled and domiciled in France is that of a contemporary of Lablache, Tamburini. He, too, has a numerous family, and a wife who left the stage as soon as her husband's fame began to dawn. "I do not sing well enough for the wife of Tamburini," said she modestly, and so she contented herself with home and her children. They have now a beautiful house, and are amongst the class of artists we are describing, artists who have preserved the dignity and respectability of private life, and who have not availed themselves of genius to throw aside the world's laws and principles. Tamburini is less witty, less joyous than Lablache, whose Neapolitan nature ever, spite of age, comes to the surface. Still he loves to bring around him all his former comrades, all the artists who are now treading in his footsteps, and without jealousy or envy to listen to their triumphs. Tamburini had a beautiful daughter who very nearly escaped being a great lady, and immigrating from this artist world, where the children of one are the children of all, like their joys and their sorrows, which all share alike. Beautiful was she as a young Psyche, brought up with an exemplary mother's care, simple, unaffected, and untrammelled by the conventionalities of Parisian life, utterly devoid of boldness, unconscious of her charms, singing like a young bird, this fair creature fascinated and allured all. Soon her hand was sought, and Tamburini saw his daughter's brow about to wear a ducal coronet. He sighed as he told his wife the brilliant destiny that opened for their child. The mother wept. She felt she should lose her daughter. Still, it was not just to throw so high, so bright a fate away. Putting her arm around her, and looking earnestly into those large, serene eyes, she asked her daughter if she would be a duchess, if she would like to live at court, in a fine hotel in the dark, gloomy faubourg, and to leave them all. A shade gathered over that sweet, placid face, and the big tears dimmed the fawn-like eyes. Not one temptation was there in title, wealth, or station. "Oh, mother," said she, blushing, "I am an artist's daughter. Let me be an artist's wife." "The happiest fate. I would not change it for a crown," replied the mother. Still the noble suitor would take no denial, and persisted in his suit, and the world wondered at the fortune of Tamburini's daughter. Some months later she was married, but she did not become a duchess. An artist's daughter, she became an artist's wife, and now, as her mother gloried in Tamburini's triumphs, the daughter listens with delight to the applause which in Paris, London, and St. Petersburg has nightly greeted Gardoni, one of the great tenors of the day. Thus live the artists in a world of their own. Sometimes the children are away, then how eagerly will tidings of them be waited for by all! How will their career be watched by all! How will their return be greeted by all, welcomed in one house as warmly as in the other, so that they scarcely know which is their home! All the great musicians and great composers are in this society; many of the great patrons of music, and a few of its great patronesses. Many foreigners of the highest rank, Russians, who have known these great artists in the Muscovite Paris, Spaniards, Germans, English, for your artist is cosmopolitan, love to do homage as they pass through Paris, to the celebrated artists in their homes. Liszt has his home in Paris. Rossini lived there for many, many years. David, too, is here. Poor Donizetti died there. Bellini is buried within its walls. Meyerbeer, the colossus of music, whose muse is inspired but every 5 years, does not disdain the artistic capital of Europe. Dupré, the artist whom the French public rejected, and who, crossing the Alps, was received with enthusiasm by the Italians, after which the Parisians deigned to recognize his genius, has also a salon of which his young daughter, Caroline, is the star, giving by her high-bred manners and her reserved and irreproachable conduct a higher and perhaps rather a more formal tone to this than any other of the artistic réunions. Roger, the tenor, who has recently quitted the Grand Opera, has a beautiful hotel, furnished with most exquisite taste. His receptions are on Sundays, the artist's leisure day. Here all the great and successful artists meet together, and, as their fancy inspires them, sit down to the piano and sing, as an artist will sing, to an audience of artists, with taste and expression, such as an ordinary public never inspire. Crivelli, Bosio, Grisi, Parodi, may be grouped together; Bocardé, a tenor unknown as yet to these regions; Verdi, Frazzoloni, Borghimamo, Alboni, Alari, the composer of the Tre Nozze. Roger is a man of great refinement, and celebrated for his appreciation of every art as well as music. He is generous and thoughtless, and but that he makes more money than it is almost possible to spend, he might find it difficult to indulge in his munificence. Hearing of the privations endured by the troops in the Crimea, it occurred to Roger, who was singing at Hamburg, to contribute towards their relief. He sent neither clothing nor blankets nor provisions, but 1,500 francs to buy cigars for the suffering troops. Probably the want of cigars was the only privation from which Roger had ever suffered, for endowed with a handsome person, a charming voice, and a good musical education, success attended him from the first cavatina, or rather song, he ever sang. He made his first appearance at the Opéra Comique, and has sang equally well and with equal success in Italian, French, and German. Berlioz, too, the musical critic, the composer of mystic music, the inventor of what he calls tragedies without words, has a reception day, at which, besides musicians, the élite of journalism meet. Hector Berlioz married many years ago an English, or at least what the French called an Englishwoman, though the English called her what she was, an Irishwoman, Miss Smithson. She was an actress whose beauty had created for her a temporary success in London, but whose Irish accent grated harshly on the Saxon ear, so that, finding the atmosphere of London ungenial, she had the happy thought of trying a Parisian public, who, so far from understanding Irish, did not even understand English. They, however, understood the fine face and beautiful attitudes of the beautiful actress, and, with Ducis' translations in hand, by which they must have been doubly mystified, the classical and learned public of Paris flocked nightly to see, if not to hear, Shakespeare, pronouncing La belle Smithson the finest actress of the stage. But the public will, after a time, get tired, even of what they do not understand, and finding they made no progress in English literature, the Théâtre Anglais gradually lost its vogue. Then Miss Smithson married Hector Berlioz, and at the last she found her real vocation, for she proved a true and faithful wife, embellishing the circle in which her husband's genius placed her, forgetting that she had ever been a celebrity. Her place is vacant now. A year ago she was carried to Père Lachaise, and there is a desolate and neglected air in the salon she used to animate. All miss her genial smile, her hearty welcome, for her foreign alliance and their adoption of another country had not made her forget the country of her birth, or its distinguishing virtue, hospitality. Scribe, too, has a day for seeing his friends; but then Scribe is so rich, what with the millions he has gained, and the millions he has married, that his, though an artistic salon, attracts many graver and more important guests. Politicians, magistrates, savants, and financiers, of course, for financiers love the vicinity of riches, though they may never come within their grasp. Here might be seen Ponsard, he who revived, and not for Rachel, the classical tragedy of Racine, beginning with the chef-d'œuvre Lucrèce. Then his rival in talent, though his friend in affection, Émile Augier, the author of Gabrielle; Mérimée, Saintine, the author of Picciola; Horace Vernet, Ingres, Halévy, the composer of the Juive; Aubert, the author of Masaniello; Flandrin, a painter of the pure Italian school; Biard, the most expressive of artists, whether in a witty sketch for a cabinet picture, or in the gravest scenes of history; Fouldre, the banker, minister, and now imperial director of the Grand Opera; Baroche, the eloquent orator, whose fine head, with its short, thick, sunny curls clustering around it, arrests the attention even before the sonorous voice has time to reach the ear. In these réunions of Scribe there are few of the other sex. His wife, who was not of this circle, has no artistic aspirations, and, as we have said, these salons are not Bohème, and therefore none of Bohème's fairest ornaments are admitted here. Madame Scribe's kindness, indulgence, and toleration for artistic caprices and eccentricities, which she neither criticises nor understands, does not extend to sanctioning the erratic, romantic, and picturesque behaviour of women of genius, whether actresses or artists. Some of her old friends may gather round her, forming a small quiet circle, knitting and embroidery in hand, at a large round table near the fire, but they are women of her own age, never accused of genius; or young demure girls who dare not either become geniuses themselves or admire genius in others, until after they are married. You do not imagine that Alexandre Dumas has no trysting place, other than the bureau of the Mousquetaire, the wittiest journal in the world, he whose hospitality is so great, that, to paraphrase a saying of the Emperor Caligula, whom he took for the hero of a not very successful tragedy, he would wish that he could concentrate the whole human race, so that he might entertain them all at one time. Alexandre Dumas then has a home in which to see his friends, not now the far-famed magnificence of Monte Cristo, which is said to have surpassed even the fabulous splendour of the Monte Cristo of his imagination, that is abandoned, Dumas having forgotten the one trite command contained in Mrs. Glass's direction of how to cook a hare. "First catch your hare," says the good lady. Dumas forgot that, to be Monte Cristo, it was necessary to "first catch your island with the secret treasure," and so some importunate creditors took the liberty of bringing this necessity to his mind. Still he has a home, and of course it is open to every one who asks his hospitality. His entertainments and his society vary like his genius and his works. Now, under the superintendence of his daughter, propriety prevails, and Dumas himself becomes quite pastoral. There is not a word said that might not be put down in a moral tale. At other times, the daughter having retired, Dumas assembles a literary coterie, and the conversation, if not strictly moral, is vastly instructive, the language, if not positively classical, is without doubt witty and sparkling, the supper and the wines worthy of the conversation and the guests. No ladies ever trespass on these strictly artistic réunions, though there are other entertainments, We told you Dumas' hospitalities were various, in which ladies play a conspicuous part. We have heard it said, that suppers have been given in which the lovely guests, dancers by profession, it must be confessed, and Spaniards by birth, it cannot be denied, were known to have danced on the table, skilfully avoiding all plates and glasses, greatly to the admiration of the journalists, critics, authors, and young secretaries of various embassies, who assisted at these feats. But then these doings resemble those of Bohème, and with these we have nothing to do, and less to say. Therefore we will not pursue this sketch, which, rightly to speak, had no place here, for if ever this table dance was danced, Brussels was the scene of the exploit, and not Paris. Another salon, it shall be our last, is one which, like that of Dumas, has various phases, though it is the salon of a woman. But that woman is Rachel, and, like Dumas, she has different aspects to her character. Her genius assumes different forms. When first the young Melpomene emerged from the shades of a small theatre, on to the most trying stage in the world, that of the Théâtre Français, she was, though familiar, by instinct, with genius, and knowing, by instinct, all that is grand in poetry and art, totally unacquainted with the world. This utter ignorance of society, its forms and its usages, added to her extreme youth, led her to be silent and reserved, so that the various lion hunters who eagerly sought her out, bestowed on her the name of the savage Hermione. None were prepared to find under the tragic toga the heart and tastes of an Aspasia, her wit, her tastes, her talents, her love of luxury, and her passions. For some years the high-minded girl, for such she was, had the most enviable position of any woman in Europe. Her success, fabulous as it appeared even to herself, had made her neither arrogant nor conceited. Reverenced by her own family, whose benefactress she was, admired and courted by all, she maintained a simple, quiet dignity which impressed every one with respect. Her appearance in public places created quite a sensation. She was in the habit of frequenting the Chamber of Deputies, in order to study the various inflections of the human voice, but the speakers on these occasions were sure of a very inattentive audience, for the interest even of the greatest politicians gave way before their curiosity, to gaze on and to admire the classical, pure-minded, and dignified young tragic muse. But a year or two wrought a change. The soaring genius, who, besides being a woman of genius, was a woman endowed with common sense, had been studying the world, and comprehended all in which she was wanting. Endowed with all that cannot be learned, she knew nothing that can be taught. There is an autograph letter extant addressed to Desjazette, thanking her for the great kindness and generosity with which she helped her through the first struggles with poverty, which, though charmingly expressed, is very badly spelled. Her language, too, when not that of the poets, was not always either elegant or correct. But in 2 years all these defects had been corrected. Rachel, no longer reserved or timid, was found to be not only a genius, but a woman full of intellect, elegance, and wit. Her repartees were quoted, her grace, which Janin had called angular grace, her elegance and ease of manner lauded to the skies. The Countess du Châtel, who had taken a mother's interest in her, making her pass whole weeks in her house, contributed to the high tone of her manners. Rachel, at this phase of her existence, could command any of the most exclusive salons to open its doors to her. The Duchess of Berwick, the Countess Torriani, the Noailles, Montemarts, all the embassies felt honoured by her presence, and would put on their invitations to meet Mademoiselle Rachel, as they do when guests are invited to meet a prince of the royal blood. Rachel was a pious follower of her religion, and though that religion was one abhorred by Catholicism, for Rachel is a Jewess, her very piety became a merit in the eyes of fashion. Generous, too, she was, and is. Distress of whatever creed, or under whatever form, or in whatever language it may appeal to her, never appealed in vain. She was the rara avis. Words could not be found to speak her praises. Her conduct was irreproachable. Not one scandal had been breathed either in the theatre or out of it. At this crisis she went to London, and there, sharing the common enthusiasm, Queen Victoria, generally a pattern of reserved propriety, testified her admiration, bestowing on her a magnificent bracelet, and by an inscription placing the royalty of talent by the royalty of descent. Victoria to Rachel, said the bracelet, and Rachel felt that her reign had begun. She returned to Paris. She was rich, she had but to speak and greater riches came. She changed. The marble statue became a woman. Her taste for luxury knew no bounds. No Eastern palace surpassed the home she created for herself. Her caprices, her follies, her extravagances were the wonder of the day. Her early friends remonstrated, but they were unheeded. Soon came such reports of the wild wanderings of the muse that friends in affright withdrew. No scandalous passion, no intrigue was imputed, but it was said that she who knew so well how to express the passions of Greek and Roman heroines, had also revived the orgies and the vices of old Greece and Rome. Still her genius increased from year to year. The public favour too, for the public knew nothing of what her friends deplored. Rachel now was a potentate herself, she wanted no patronizing, and she, with her ardent passions and energetic will, resolved to enjoy life in her own way. Perhaps there is no truth in all that has been said, perhaps from her very friends may have come these rumours, for virtue is not indulgent or charitable, and admits but one way of being virtuous, its own, and so may Indulgence and Prudery have turned away. Be it as it may, Rachel has around her all the remarkable men of the day. She has young sisters with her, she is protected by her brothers, she will no longer condescend to be patronized, and therefore goes no more into the salons of the great. There are few women in her circle she cares not for their society, but she is the very Semiramis of the artistic world, and her hotel, sometimes the very Areopagus of intellect, is considered the imperial palace of Bohème. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of the Ins and Outs of Paris, or Paris by Day and Night, by Julie de Margueritte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The burial places of 3 dynasties. We have talked a great deal about Les Invalides. We have gazed from afar at its gilded dome. Some of its inmates we have met in our peregrinations, but we have never been to this great institution of a great king. Let us go now. Louis XIV founded Les Invalides, this home for the old soldiers who had fought for the quarrels of kings, for interests and insults of which they knew nothing, without either honour, glory, fortune, or renown. It is but just that with their blood they should have earned a home for their age and infirmities. Louis XIV, le Grand Monarque, founded Les Invalides. And yet it is not Louis XIV and his plumed court that come before you as you pass beneath these grand majestic arches. The thoughts wander not so far. But the spirit which hovers over you is that whose memory, though he himself is mouldering in the grave, has more power over the hearts and imagination of his own and all other people than any hero of antiquity, or any conqueror, or potentate of modern times. Napoleon, in the grand simplicity of his nature, rises before you, and each veteran soldier, as he passes, recalls to you some of those wondrous battles, which in recital have so entranced your youth. He too lies here, brought by the justice which time brings to all, though some like him await it in their graves, dying as he did in exile and in bitterness. But he has returned. One nation had mourned him, all nations welcome him, and now he reposes in the midst of his people, where still his laws govern, his dynasty rules, where his image still stands by every fireside, and where his spirit ever hovered. Many terrible events had shaken the very hearthstones of France, dynasties had changed, once more had the old Bourbon kings sought the hospitality of the Stuart palace. 2 fatal names beneath a fatal roof. Blood had flowed again through the streets of Paris. The cannon had boomed through its churches and its palaces. The very religion of Rome had been despoiled of its power in France. But still the heart of the people had not beat with one mighty throb as now it beats, when the voice went forth, proclaiming, "He is returned! To-morrow he will be here!" It was the very depth of winter, the snow had fallen and the long icicles hung weepingly from the trees. The dull heavens lowered in grey masses o'er the city. Men shuddered as hastily, closely wrapped in cloaks, they sped along the streets. Women kept by their bright firesides, shivering as they drew the soft silk and cashmere around their tender forms. Little children clung closely to each other in their cradle beds, and the poor, crouching beneath the porch of the churches, prayed till oblivion sent them dreams of warm and genial skies. Yet throughout all the day of the 14th of December, 1840, groups assembled in all parts of the city. Not noisy, nor joyous, nor animated, as are the people on a holiday, but hushed and calm, speaking in low, tremulous voices. Then he who had seen the hero living, whom dead they were awaiting with such beating hearts, became himself a hero, and they gathered round him, and looking on him with veneration, would inquire, "How looked he then? What said he when he placed the cross upon your breast? Did he not love the poor soldier and honour him, like any prince or general? Tell us of him and of his deeds." All the usual pursuits and avocations of the world were suspended and thrown aside. In every house, young and old, rich and poor, forgot their griefs, their joys, their interests, in expectation of this resurrection of the past. From sundown, or rather from twilight, for no sun had risen on this day, the circulation of all carriages and horses was forbidden in the streets. Yet all night long might be heard the tramp of many, many feet, the multitude of the villages around coming from afar, to meet with solemn welcome their long lamented friend and sovereign. At length the dawn broke, and the dull light fell on the silent yet crowded streets, all hastening to one point. Occasionally an aide de camp would ride rapidly through the streets, taking to the palace tidings of the progress of the funereal procession. Then all would lapse into silence, a strange mysterious silence, the silence of the multitude. Down to the Champs Elysées came the human stream. There, stationed in double row, stood the army and the National Guard. Behind them were the crowd, a crowd in which all ranks were mingled, or rather in which, for this day at least, they were forgotten. From tree to tree flowed silken draperies of imperial purple, banners floated from the ice-covered branches. Here gigantic statues reared their white forms, bearing palms and laurel crowns. There, on high columns, burned the flaming incense. The centre, the wide road, alone was solitary. Not one dared to infringe on its limits, or cross its path. Along here he was to come on his way to the Invalides, where dwelt his children, and where, henceforth, he was to dwell for ever. Now a distant shout is borne on the sharp chilly wind, nearer yet, nearer still, he comes! There aloft, above all, on a car like a temple of victory, there, covered by a purple crape dotted with his golden bees, there lies the dust of him you love, of him whom tears now welcome, and one deep and universal cry of "Vive l'Empereur!" On he came. The cannon of the Invalides boomed at regular intervals, and the bells of every church, from the great bells of Notre Dame to those of the tiniest village, greeted him. As he came, the troops presented arms, and then again the people's mighty voice, now gathered into one, cried out, "Vive l'Empereur!" Solemn, though heartfelt, was their tone. It was the hero they welcomed, and memorials of his victories were around them. To his glory they did homage, yet could they not forget the martyrdom and exile which, for years, had bound him to a burning rock. By the funeral car, sadly yet proudly walked the veterans of his army, surviving thus to witness this last and greatest triumph of their chief. Hubert, the faithful Hubert, who for 19 years had, untiring sentinel of the dead, kept watch by the solitary tomb, now heard the triumphant march of the pale, sad spirit he alone had not deserted. Here, too, was the young prince of the new dynasty which filled the emperor's throne, and the sailors who had brought his ashes over the wide seas, to the haven where they were to rest. But nor prince nor mariners had an interest for the people now. They were with the past and with the dead, and thought not on the present or the living. On he came, and now he reaches the triumphal arch, under which, as yet none have passed, the Arc de l'Étoile. As the car glides under its gateway, the grey dull clouds vanish from the sky. Out bursts the brilliant sun, tinging with bright glow the imperial purple, turning the sad icicles into sprays of glittering diamonds, illuminating with genial warmth the thousands and thousands of faces turned eagerly towards its rays. Then from 1,000 voices arose the cry, "Le soleil d'Austerlitz!" The sun, which had helped to win the victory of Austerlitz, now burst through its winter bonds to welcome him. And now he has passed beneath the gates, and the dead chief, for an instant, is once more in the midst of his soldiers, his generals, and his staff, whose names, though they like him are ashes, stand indelibly inscribed on these stone walls. On, still on, and he has passed the other gate. He is in Paris, in his own capital, which he had meant to make the capital of the civilized world. He is here at last. And now he is borne to the home for which his spirit craved, the Dome of the Invalides, where many who have waited for him are crumbling into dust around him, and where those who survive to see him take possession of his tomb are weeping for sorrow and for joy. The sovereign of the present descends from his throne too, and receives the sovereign, not of the past or present but of all time, whose spirit has ever reigned and reigns in France. To strains of heavenly music, hallowed by the prayers of the Church, by the pomps of royalty, and by the tears of many, they laid his ashes where they will rest forever in the midst of his warriors and his people. Here beneath the dome he lies, in that quiet, solemn tomb, so simple yet so grand, so full of majesty, so full of repose, yet even as you look, inspiring thoughts of heroic deeds, and sad thoughts of fallen fortunes and inexorable fate come o'er you, elevating the soul from this silent tomb to other realms. To have beheld the last scene of the most wondrous history the world ever saw, is like having evoked the past generation from its grave, or like some brilliant realization of a dream. Like the Egyptians of old, who buried their dead under their hearthstones, and lived with the urns of those they loved and venerated around them, the French people feel that they have now their fathers' ashes within the sanctuary of their homes. From all parts of this vast city, either in the bright sunlight, or by the pale moonbeams, is that glittering dome of the Invalides to be seen, and the children of Paris, as they suffer, watch and toil, gaze on it, and think he feels for all, now that he is there in their midst. Not long after this ceremony, which filled the imagination yet surpassed all it could conceive, there came another ceremony and another funeral. The sun shone brightly, and the green trees waved, the fountains played gaily in the light, and the roses bloomed in all their glory, and he who was about to be hidden forever from this busy world was in the heyday of youth, prosperous, happy, beloved, and deserving of that love. Yet, though all felt pity for his fate, though all felt compassion for his weeping mother and his sisters, for his manly brothers standing round his coffin, for his aged father bowed beneath his grief, still the world and the world's avocations went on their usual busy round, pleasure itself scarce paused in its career, when Ferdinand of Orleans, the kind and noble prince, was taken from his palace, from his young children, from his loving wife, to be buried by his gentle sister, Marie. Still that small chapel erected at Neuilly, by a mother's love, over the spot where he fell and died, in its cold grey simplicity speaks of a deep and inconsolable grief. All the elements of interest, nay of romance, are here in this sad catastrophe. The pallid corpse of the noble form which but an hour before had sprung with so light a step, and so light a laugh into that carriage from which death hurled him forth. The old man, a stricken father following, weeping, tottering, leaning on the trembling arm of the mother, whose trust in Heaven made her endure this blow, this last scene where the heir to a throne, so long and deeply played for, was taken from evil to come. Yet somehow the Bourbons, particularly the younger branch, are wanting in one element so eminently French, in the dramatic; and their joys, their sorrows, even their deaths, fail to impress the multitude. The French people listen coldly to the appeals made to them by sense, propriety, and logic. Helena, the young widow of this very prince, bearing like Maria Theresa her children in her arms, fails when she appeals in the Chamber, though she shows the young heirs of him they loved and respected, to rouse in the French bosom one spark of that enthusiasm which at the words of the Austrian Empress made every Hungarian sword leap from its scabbard. Vainly, too, did the daughter of Maria Theresa, the unhappy but heroic Marie Antoinette, strive to inspire her husband and her sovereign with one spark of kingly dignity which should repel and awe the crowd. The son of St. Louis was born to be a martyr, not a hero, and in his death only was he worthy of his ancestor who conquered in Palestine, and died in suffering and misery in the Moslem land. He, too, Louis XVI., rests in another funeral pile of this capital, where death and victory have alike their monuments. He, Louis XVI., and the beautiful Marie Antoinette of Austria, or all that could be found of them of few whitened bones, rest in the Chapelle Expiatoire of the Rue d'Anjou, a chapel raised to their memory by the elder Bourbons, during their brief sojourn in the land of their forefathers. So, within the walls of Paris, rest the representatives of 3 dynasties which ruled its people since the Republic recalled the sovereign power: Napoleon, the Bourbons of both branches, they who were kings by divine right, and he who was chosen by the people. Passed away from the memory of this generation is a solitary scion of the elder race, the lineal descendant of the dead sovereigns, who rest here now in silence and neglect. Unthought of and untended is the pale, cold, grey chapel erected in the memory of the Bourbon, whose father fled like a culprit from his throne, whose young heirs now are exiles and outlaws from their native land. Napoleon alone lives in the hearts and memories of his people. On every tower his banner waves. On the throne he raised from the dust, where the feet of the indignant multitude had spurned it, sits one in whose veins flows his blood, not only his, but the blood of his loved Josephine, the guiding star of his fate, a star which, while it ruled, led but to glory and success. Perhaps that solitary star had gleamed, in pale and loving watchfulness, on the distant tomb to which the waves murmured eternal requiems, perhaps its holy and benign rays have followed the beloved dust to the gorgeous tomb where now it rests, who shall say? But entwined forever are the 2 names of Josephine and Napoleon, while the daughter of the Caesars, Maria Louisa, the mother of the heir so long desired, he whose life scarce marked its passage on the earth, rests in coldness and contempt in a land where his name is forbidden. Well might the young chief engrave on his first simple gift to Josephine his new-made bride, "A mon étoile." She was his star, his destiny, his fortune. For the star that guides, that rules, that leads even genius to high destinies, the star that inspires courage, that restrains and hallows, is holy, tender, unchanging and devoted love, such as she felt for him. End of chapter 28, and the end of the Ins and Outs of Paris, or Paris by Day and Night, by Julie de Margueritte. Recorded by Celine Major.